Before we begin, good day, dear listeners. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where passion, betrayal, and vengeance intertwine beneath the glittering chandeliers of England's most powerful estates. But today's tale is different. Today, we step into a story where desperation shatters every rule of society, where a dying heir forces a proud duke to his knees, and where salvation comes from the most impossible source imaginable. Before we enter the fevered halls of Blackthorn Manor in 1842, I have a question for you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Are you in London, New York, Nairobi? Are you curled up in bed or walking through your city streets? Perhaps you're on the other side of the world, seeking refuge in a story that reminds you that miracles can come from the most unexpected places. Wherever you are about to witness something extraordinary. You are about to see 18 of England's finest physicians fail. You are about to watch a duke, the most powerful man in 3 counties, brought to his knees by love and terror. And you are about to meet a boy who should not exist in this world, who should not be here, who should not have the knowledge he possesses, but he does. And tonight, that changes everything. So settle in. Pour yourself something strong, because this is not a story about medicine. This is a story about miracles. And miracles, as you know, never come without a price. The Duke of Blackthorn was not a man who begged. In his 34 years, Matthias Corvinus had bent to no one. His title stretched back 7 generations. His wealth was staggering even among the aristocracy, and his word was law across half of Lancashire. He had inherited his dukedom at 19 when his father died in a hunting accident, and he had ruled his estates with an iron fist ever since. Cold, calculating, ruthless in business, and unforgiving in personal matters, that was the Duke of Blackthorn. Men feared him. Women found him intimidating. Even his peers in the House of Lords treated him with wary respect. But tonight, on this bitter February evening in 1842, he was on his knees. The nursery of Blackthorn Manor was suffocating with the smell of camphor, laudanum, and something else. Something sweet and sickly that made his stomach turn. Death. That was the smell. Death creeping through his ancestral home like a thief in the night, reaching for the one thing in this world that mattered more than his title, his wealth, his pride, his very life. His son, Alexander Matthias Corvinus, 3 months old, heir to the Blackthorn fortune and the 7 generations of power that came with it. The child he had waited years for, prayed for in moments of weakness he would never admit to anyone. The son who had finally been born after his wife, Rosalind, had suffered 3 devastating miscarriages that had nearly broken them both. The baby who had come into the world on a cold November morning, screaming and perfect and gloriously, miraculously alive. Now, dying. The word echoed in Matthias's mind like a death knell. Dying. His son was dying, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, he could do to stop it. Your Grace. The voice belonged to Dr. Pemberton, the 18th physician to examine the child in the past 72 hours. The most expensive doctor in all of London, summoned by emergency carriage at a cost that would have fed an entire village for a year. A man whose reputation preceded him, whose client list included princes and prime ministers, whose fees were so exorbitant that only the wealthiest families in England could afford his services. And he had failed, just like the 17 before him. Dr. Pemberton stood near the door of the nursery, his leather medical bag in his wrinkled hand, his face grave beneath his graying hair. He had the look of a man who had delivered bad news before, who had perfected the expression of professional sympathy that doctors wore when they had exhausted all options and death was inevitable. "I have done everything within my power," Pemberton said, his voice carefully modulated, neither too emotional nor too cold. The fever is beyond anything I have encountered in my 30 years of practice. His lungs are filling with fluid at an alarming rate. His heart is weakening with each passing hour. The child's constitution, I'm afraid, is simply not strong enough to fight this illness. I am. He paused, as if searching for the right words. I am deeply, profoundly sorry, Your Grace, but there is nothing more to be done. It is only a matter of time now. Hours, perhaps, certainly not more than a day. I recommend you and the Duchess say your goodbyes while the child is still aware. Matthias did not turn from where he knelt beside the ornate mahogany cradle that had been in his family for generations. His hand rested on the carved edge, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. Inside the cradle, nestled in silk blankets that cost more than a workman's yearly wage, his son lay dying. Alexander's tiny chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps that seemed far too fast, far too desperate. The baby's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look like a wax doll rather than a living child. His lips were tinged with blue, a sign Dr. Pemberton had explained earlier, that his blood was not receiving enough air. His eyes, those eyes that were supposed to be Corvinus gray, the distinctive mark of their bloodline that could be traced back centuries, were closed, the lids dark and sunken, giving his tiny face a skeletal appearance that was horrifying to behold. The baby made a sound, a wet, rattling wheeze that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It was the sound of drowning, of lungs filling with fluid, of a body giving up its fight for life. Get out! Matthias's voice was flat, dead, empty of all emotion, because if he allowed himself to feel anything at all, he would shatter into 1,000 pieces right here on the nursery floor. Your Grace, I understand this is difficult, but I said get out. Dr. Pemberton hesitated for only a moment. Then he set down his bag with deliberate care, extracted a small bottle of laudanum, and placed it on the side table. For the pain, he said quietly. When the end comes, it will ease his suffering. A few drops on the tongue, no more. And Your Grace, I truly am sorry. Sometimes, despite all our learning and all our efforts, nature simply takes its course. Nature takes its course. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation, as if his son were merely a leaf falling from a tree, something inevitable and unremarkable, as if Alexander were not a precious, irreplaceable human life, but simply another statistic in the grim ledger of infant mortality that claimed so many children before their first birthday. Matthias heard the doctor's footsteps retreat down the corridor, heard the quiet closing of the nursery door, and then there was only silence. Silence, and the terrible, labored breathing of his dying son. Behind him, near the tall windows that overlooked the snow-covered gardens, his wife Rosalind sat motionless in a velvet chair. She had not moved in hours, had not spoken since this morning when Dr. Pemberton had arrived and delivered his verdict. After 3 lost children, and now this, watching their miracle baby, their last hope, slip away into death, she had simply stopped, shut down, broken completely. Her auburn hair, usually so carefully arranged, hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Her gown, an expensive creation of emerald silk, was wrinkled and stained with tears that had dried hours ago. Her hands lay limp in her lap, and her eyes stared at nothing, seeing nothing. She looked like a ghost herself, like someone who had already died inside and was simply waiting for her body to catch up with the truth. They had tried everything. 18 doctors, 18 different diagnoses, 18 different treatments, each more desperate and painful than the last. The first doctor, their regular physician, Dr. Harrison, had diagnosed inflammation of the lungs and ordered the baby to be bled with leeches. Matthias had watched in horror as the black, writhing creatures were placed on his son's tiny body, watched them swell with blood, watched Alexander grow paler and weaker. The second doctor had declared it was corruption of the blood and prescribed mercury treatments. The baby had vomited repeatedly, his small body convulsing, and the fever had only grown worse. The third had called it an imbalance of humors and ordered alternating warm baths and cold compresses. Alexander had screamed with each temperature change, his cries growing weaker each time. The fourth had suggested spiritual affliction and sent for a priest who had performed an exorcism that had lasted 2 hours and accomplished nothing except terrifying the nursemaids. The fifth through 17th doctors had each offered their own theories. Miasma from the marsh, bad air in the nursery, demonic possession, punishment for ancestral sins, weak constitution, tainted mother's milk, curse from jealous servants. They had prescribed everything from arsenic to zinc, from prayers to purgatives, from bleeding to blistering. None of it had worked. Each treatment had only made the baby weaker. Each doctor had left shaking his head, pocketing his exorbitant fee, offering meaningless condolences that all sounded the same. These things happen with infants, Your Grace. The constitution is weak. Nature must take its course. God's will. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps it is for the best. The child might have been simple-minded, deformed, a burden. At least this way, you can try again for a healthy heir. Matthias had wanted to strike them, every single one of them. These pompous, educated men with their fancy degrees from Cambridge and Oxford, their published papers and royal appointments, their absolute certainty in their own knowledge, even as that knowledge failed again and again and again. But he had not struck them, because what if they were right? What if there truly was nothing to be done? What if his son was simply meant to die, and all the money and power and titles in the world could not change that fundamental truth? Now, alone with his dying child, Matthias reached into the cradle with a trembling hand and touched his son's forehead. The skin was burning hot, so hot it almost hurt to touch, dry as parchment. The baby did not stir at the contact, did not open his eyes, did not give any sign that he felt his father's touch. Please. The word escaped Matthias's lips before he could stop it, barely a whisper, broken and desperate. Please don't leave me. Please, I'll do anything. Anything. Just don't go. Don't leave us. Please. He did not know who he was begging. God? Fate? The universe itself? The child who could not possibly hear or understand? It didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the tiny body in the cradle, growing cooler and stiller with each passing moment. His son was dying, and Matthias Corvinus, the Duke of Blackthorn, one of the most powerful men in England, was completely, utterly, devastatingly powerless to stop it. A soft knock at the nursery door made him stiffen, his jaw clenched with fury. He had given explicit orders. No more doctors, no more priests, no more well-meaning visitors with their useless sympathy and empty platitudes. He wanted to be left alone with his son, to be present for whatever time remained, to bear witness to this unbearable tragedy without an audience. I said no more doctors, he called out, his voice raw with suppressed emotion and exhausted rage. It's not a doctor, Your Grace. The voice belonged to Mrs. Heaton, the head housekeeper who had served his family for more than 40 years. An old woman with kind eyes and capable hands who had helped raise Matthias himself after his mother died. She was one of the few people in the world he trusted completely. It's someone else. Someone who wishes to see the young master. I don't care who it is. Send them away. I will not have gawkers and gossips parading through here to satisfy their morbid curiosity." There was a pause, a longer one than he expected. Then Mrs. Heaton's voice came again, quieter but somehow more insistent. "Your Grace, with respect, I think you should see this person. I think it might be important." Something in her tone made him turn his head. Mrs. Heaton stood in the doorway, her weathered face unreadable in the dim candlelight, and beside her, partially hidden in shadow, stood a figure so small and unexpected that for a moment Matthias thought he must be hallucinating from exhaustion and grief. A boy, no more than 12 or 13 years old at most, painfully thin, like someone who had not eaten properly in weeks or months, dressed in clothes that could barely be called clothes at all, torn trousers that were too short for his legs, a shirt that had once been white but was now gray with age and dirt and wear, no shoes, despite the freezing February weather. His feet were bare and filthy, covered in cuts and calluses. But it was the boy's appearance that made Matthias stare. His skin was dark, darker than anyone Matthias had ever seen in Lancashire. Darker even than the few African sailors who sometimes docked at Liverpool. A deep, rich brown that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. His hair was close-cropped, almost shaved, and covered with what looked like coal dust or soot. The boy's face was gaunt, all sharp cheekbones and hollowed cheeks, the face of someone who had known hunger intimately and for a long time. But his eyes stopped Matthias cold. They were ancient. There was no other word for it. The boy's eyes were deep brown, almost black, and they held a weight, a knowing, that no child should possess. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things, terrible things, and survived them. The eyes of someone far older than the thin, ragged body that contained them. And those eyes looked at Matthias with neither fear nor deference. They looked at him with something that might have been pity, or understanding, or both. "Who the hell is this?" Matthias demanded, rising to his feet. He was tall, over 6 feet, and he used his height now, trying to intimidate, trying to regain some sense of control in a situation where he had none. "Mrs. Heaton, what is the meaning of this? I gave you explicit instructions. He was at the servants' entrance, Your Grace." Mrs. Heaton's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she used when she disagreed with him, but knew better than to say so directly. "He asked to see the young master. He says—" She hesitated, then continued. "He says he can help." "Help?" Matthias's voice rose, sharp with disbelief and rising fury. This was too much. This was beyond reason. 18 trained physicians, 18 of the best medical minds in England, couldn't save my son. And you bring me a street urchin? A filthy, barefoot child? Have you lost your mind? I'm not from the streets." The boy's voice cut through Matthias's anger like a knife. It was quiet, but clear, with an accent Matthias couldn't place, something musical and unfamiliar, each word precisely pronounced, as if English were not his first language, but one he had learned carefully and well. "And I can save your son," the boy continued, those ancient eyes never leaving Matthias's face, "if you will allow me to try." The sheer audacity of it struck Matthias speechless for a long moment. This ragged child, this impossible figure standing in his nursery, making claims that no rational person could believe. It was absurd. It was insulting. It was— From the cradle came a sound that made Matthias's blood run cold. A wet, choking gasp, different from the other sounds his son had been making. Worse, somehow. More desperate. More final. Matthias spun back to the cradle. Alexander's tiny body was convulsing slightly, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe. His lips had gone from blue to nearly purple. A thin stream of fluid leaked from the corner of his mouth. "Your Grace." It was Rosalind's voice, the first words she had spoken in hours. Broken. Devastated. She had risen from her chair and was stumbling toward the cradle, her hands outstretched. "He's getting worse. Oh God, Matthias, he's dying. He's dying right now." Her voice rose into a wail, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to tear the very air apart. Matthias stood frozen between his dying son and this impossible boy, who claimed he could help. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, that this was a desperate child trying to exploit a desperate father, that nothing good could come from this. But what did he have to lose? Everything was already lost. His son was dying, right now, in front of him, and he could do nothing but watch. He turned back to the boy, and in that moment, something shifted in his chest. Some wall crumbled, some pride dissolved, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer angry. It was simply exhausted, defeated, empty. "If you harm him," Matthias said quietly, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning, "if you cause my son even one moment of additional pain, I will kill you with my own hands. Slowly. Painfully. I will make you beg for death. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded once, solemnly. "I understand, Your Grace." "Then do whatever you claim you can do, because I have nothing left. No hope, no options, no faith in anything anymore. So if you're a miracle, prove it. And if you're a charlatan, may God have mercy on your soul, because I will not." The boy stepped forward without hesitation, moving past Matthias with a confidence that seemed entirely out of place for someone so young and so poor. He approached the cradle, and Rosalind instinctively reached for the baby, protective even now, even in her broken state. But Matthias caught her arm gently. "Let him try," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please, Rosalind, let him try." She stared at him with red-rimmed, hollow eyes. Then she stepped back, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other wrapped around her waist, as if holding herself together by force of will alone. The boy looked down at Alexander for a long moment, his face completely still, utterly focused. Then he reached out with one thin, dark hand and very gently touched the baby's chest. His fingers moved lightly over the silk blankets, pressing here and there, listening in a way that seemed to have nothing to do with ears. "What is your name?" Matthias asked suddenly, surprising himself. The boy did not look up from the baby. "Ezra, Your Grace. I am called Ezra." "Where are you from, Ezra?" "A place your people call the Gold Coast." He paused, his hand still moving gently over the baby. "I was born there, in a village by the sea, before the slavers came." Matthias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Slavers. He understood now. The boy's appearance, his presence in England, the desperation in his eyes. But before he could ask more, Ezra turned to Mrs. Heaton, who still stood in the doorway, watching with an expression that was part hope, part fear. "I need things," Ezra said, his voice calm and certain, as if he had done this 100 times before. "Boiling water, as much as you can bring, and quickly. Clean cloths, white if you have them. Salt, as much as you have in your kitchens. Fresh ginger root if it is available. If not, then dried will serve. Honey, the purest you have. Eucalyptus oil or camphor oil, whichever is closest to hand. A small bowl. And I need all of this within 5 minutes. The child is very close to death now. Every moment matters." Mrs. Heaton looked at Matthias, waiting for permission. He nodded curtly, unable to speak. She hurried away, her footsteps quick and purposeful down the corridor. Ezra turned back to the baby and began to carefully, methodically unwrap the silk blankets. Alexander lay exposed in just his tiny nightgown, his gray skin almost translucent in the candlelight. The baby's chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths that were getting weaker with each passing second. "What are you doing?" Rosalind's voice was panicked, rising. "He'll get cold. The doctors said to keep him warm." "The doctors were wrong." Ezra's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "The blankets are too heavy. They trap heat inside his body, making the fever worse. They also restrict his chest, making it harder for him to breathe. He needs air. He needs to be able to move. But, my lady, please." Ezra looked up at her, and his ancient eyes were gentle. "I know this is frightening. I know you have no reason to trust me. But your doctors have been fighting against your son's body, trying to force it to do what they think is right. I am going to help his body do what it wants to do naturally, what it needs to do to survive." He turned back to Alexander and continued his examination, his thin fingers moving with surprising confidence over the baby's chest, his throat, listening to the pattern of his breathing. Then he very gently tilted the baby's head to one side and looked into his mouth, his nose. "His lungs are full of fluid," Ezra said quietly, more to himself than to them. "The body produces it to fight the infection, but it is too much, too fast. He is drowning from the inside. The fever burns because his blood is fighting an enemy it cannot see, cannot defeat alone. The weakness comes because his body has been spending all its strength on a battle it is losing." "Can you save him?" Matthias heard himself ask, and he hated how desperate he sounded, how broken. But he was beyond pride now, beyond everything except this one desperate hope. "Yes," Ezra said it with absolute certainty, no hesitation, no qualification, just yes. "If you do not interfere, if you let me work, if you trust me even though you have no reason to, then yes, Your Grace, I can save your son." Mrs. Heaton returned at that moment, breathless, carrying a tray laden with everything Ezra had requested. Behind her came 2 housemaids, each carrying buckets of steaming water. They set everything down on the side tables and backed away, crossing themselves as they went. Ezra worked quickly now, with a speed and efficiency that spoke of practice, of knowledge earned through experience rather than books. He poured salt into the hot water, stirring it with his hand, seemingly unbothered by the heat. He added a few drops of the eucalyptus oil, and immediately the sharp, medicinal scent filled the room, cutting through the smell of death and sickness. Then he did something none of the doctors had done. He lifted Alexander from the cradle, so gently, with such care, and positioned the tiny body on his side, rather than on his back. He supported the baby against his own thin chest, one hand spread across Alexander's back, and began to tap, very gently, a rhythmic pattern, firm but not hard, working from the bottom of the tiny ribcage upward toward the shoulders. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was soft, steady, almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat or a drum. "What is he doing?" Matthias demanded, unable to stay silent, unable to just watch without understanding. "Helping the fluid move." Ezra did not stop the gentle percussion. His voice was calm, focused. "Your son's lungs want to clear themselves. That is what coughing is, the body's way of expelling what should not be there. But he is too weak to cough properly. The fluid sits in the bottom of his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. This," he continued the tapping, "this helps move the fluid upward, where the body can expel it naturally." For several long minutes, nothing happened. The only sounds in the nursery were the soft tapping, the crackling of the fire in the hearth, and Rosalind's quiet sobbing. Matthias stood frozen, watching, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Then Alexander coughed. It was a wet, rattling, horrible sound. The baby's tiny body convulsed, and suddenly fluid bubbled from his mouth, thick, yellowish mucus that smelled foul. Ezra immediately turned the baby's head to the side, letting the fluid drain out onto one of the clean cloths. "Good," he murmured. "Good." Let it out. The baby coughed again. More fluid. More of that terrible rattling sound. And again. And again. "It's working," Mrs. Heaton whispered, her weathered hand pressed against her mouth. "Dear God in heaven, it's working." Ezra continued the gentle percussion, patient and methodical, and each time Alexander coughed, more fluid came up. The baby's breathing was changing, becoming deeper, less desperate. The terrible wheeze was fading, replaced by something that sounded almost normal. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, Ezra stopped. He lifted Alexander carefully and held him upright against his chest, supporting the baby's head with one hand. Alexander's eyes fluttered open for the first time in hours. They were gray, Corvinus gray, and they were clear, alert, alive. "The worst is past," Ezra said quietly, and for the first time, there was something like relief in his ancient eyes. "The lungs are clearing, but the fever remains, and it is still dangerous. I need to bring it down slowly, carefully. Too fast, and it will shock his body, possibly stop his heart. Too slow, and it will continue to burn him from the inside." He carried the baby to the table where the salt water waited, and, using one of the clean cloths, began to sponge Alexander's skin with the warm mixture. Gentle strokes along the tiny arms, the legs, the chest, the back. The eucalyptus scent seemed to calm the baby, and his breathing steadied further. "Why salt water?" Matthias found himself asking, needing to understand, needing to know that this wasn't some kind of magic or witchcraft, but something real, something that made sense. "Salt draws heat from the body without shocking it with cold," Ezra explained as he worked. "It cools slowly, gently, and the minerals in salt help the skin, help the body regulate its temperature. The eucalyptus opens the airways, makes breathing easier, and has properties that fight infection." He continued the gentle sponging for several more minutes, then set the cloth aside and turned to the honey. He mixed it with warm water until it dissolved completely, then took a small piece of clean cloth, dipped it in the mixture, and let a few drops fall onto Alexander's lips. The baby's tongue moved instinctively, tasting the sweetness. He swallowed. A tiny, reflexive action, but it was there. He was conscious. Responding. "He needs water and honey for strength," Ezra said. "Not milk, yet. His stomach has been too traumatized by the fever and the treatments. It cannot digest properly. But honey dissolved in water will give him energy, help him fight. In a few hours, if he continues to improve, we can try milk again. But slowly, carefully. Slowly, impossibly, Alexander's skin was taking on color. The gray pallor was fading, replaced by a hint of pink. His breathing was steady and strong. His tiny fists, which had been clenched and rigid, relaxed and opened. He made a sound, not a cry of pain, but something softer, almost curious. Matthias stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. 18 trained physicians, 18 men with degrees and reputations and decades of experience. 18 failures. And this ragged boy, this impossible child who had appeared out of nowhere, had done in less than an hour what none of them could do in 3 days. Alexander was alive, not just alive, getting better, recovering, healing. How? The word came out hoarse, barely audible. Matthias's throat was tight with emotion he couldn't name. Relief, disbelief, joy, terror, gratitude, all of it at once, overwhelming him. "How did you know? How did you know what to do?" Ezra looked up at him while continuing to tend to the baby. "My grandmother was a healer in our village. She learned from her mother, who learned from her mother before her. The knowledge goes back generations, further than anyone can remember. She taught me everything she knew, how to read the body's signs, how to listen to what it needs, how to help it heal itself. He paused, his fingers gentle on Alexander's tiny hand. When the slavers came to our village, they took many people. They took me. I was 10 years old. But before they dragged me onto the ship, my grandmother pulled me close and whispered in my ear. She said, "The body knows how to heal itself. We do not heal it. We only help it remember. Listen to the body, not to the men who think they know better. The body always tells the truth." His voice had gone very quiet, very distant. I have carried her words with me every day since, through the ship, through the market in Cape Coast, where they sold us like cattle, through the voyage to your country, through my escape when we docked in Liverpool, through 2 years of running and hiding and trying to survive. "You escaped a slave ship," Matthias said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact, a recognition of what this boy had survived. "Yes, Your Grace." Ezra carefully placed Alexander back in the cradle, positioning him on his side as before, making sure he could breathe easily. "I am a runaway. I am hunted. The man who owned the ship, who owned me according to your laws, he wants me back. There is money offered for my return. A great deal of money." "You're telling me this?" Matthias stared at him. "You're admitting that you're a fugitive, that I could turn you in, collect the reward." "You could." Ezra met his gaze steadily. "But you will not." "How do you know?" "Because you are a father who would give anything, anything, to save his son. And I am the one who did what 18 learned men could not." His ancient eyes held Matthias's. "You may be a duke. You may be powerful and wealthy and used to having the world bend to your will. But tonight, in this room, I had something you did not. I had knowledge. I had truth. And I had the courage to use it, even knowing that if I failed, you might kill me." There was a long silence. Then Rosalind spoke, her voice rough from crying. "You saved my baby." She had moved to the cradle and was looking down at Alexander with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "You saved him. All those doctors, all their learning, and they couldn't. But you—" She looked up at Ezra, tears streaming down her face. "How can we ever thank you?" "I don't want thanks, my lady." "Then what do you want?" Matthias asked. "Tell me. Name your price. Money? Safe passage out of England? Papers declaring you free? Whatever it is, I will find a way to give it to you." Ezra was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Alexander, Rosalind, and Matthias. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. "I want nothing, Your Grace. I came here because I heard the servants talking in the village. They said the Duke's baby was dying. They said 18 doctors had failed. They said it was lung fever, the drowning sickness. And I knew I could help. So I came." "But why?" Matthias demanded. "Why risk exposure? Why risk being caught? Why help the family of a man you've never met?" "Because I have seen too many children die." Ezra's voice was suddenly fierce, passionate, more alive than it had been. "On the ship, in the markets, in the places I have hidden. Children who could have been saved if anyone had bothered to truly see them, truly help them. I am tired of watching children die because the people with power and knowledge use it for themselves, not for those who need it most." He looked directly at Matthias. "You have power, Your Grace, more power than I will ever have. But tonight, you were powerless. Tonight, you learned what it is to have all the wealth in the world and not be able to buy what matters most. Perhaps that will teach you something. Perhaps it will make you better. Or perhaps you will forget this feeling as soon as your son is well, and everything will go back to how it was." You judge me, Matthias said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a strange kind of recognition. I observe you, Ezra corrected. There is a difference. Before Matthias could respond, Alexander made a sound, a tiny, querulous cry that was completely normal, completely healthy. The sound of a baby who was hungry or uncomfortable, or simply wanted attention. Not the sound of a child dying, but the sound of a child living. Rosalind made a choked sound and reached into the cradle, gathering Alexander into her arms. With infinite gentleness, the baby nuzzled against her, seeking milk, and she laughed through her tears, a broken, joyful sound. He's going to live, she whispered. He's really going to live. Yes, my lady. Ezra moved toward the door, but he will need care for several more days. The saltwater baths 3 times daily, morning, afternoon, and evening. The honey mixture every few hours, as much as he will take. I have herbs that will help his lungs heal completely, but they must be prepared correctly and given at the right times. If you will allow me, I can show your cook how to make the preparations. But first, I should go. No. The word came from Matthias, sharp and immediate. Stop. Ezra froze in the doorway. You cannot leave, Matthias said, and his voice had changed, had taken on the tone of command that he used when he was absolutely certain of something. Not yet. Not until my son is fully recovered, and perhaps not even then. Your Grace, I cannot stay here. It is not safe. If I am found, if you are found, they will have to go through me. Matthias took a step toward the boy. You saved my son's life when 18 of the finest physicians in England failed. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the debt I owe you? You owe me nothing. I owe you everything. Matthias' voice was intense, urgent. Alexander is my heir, my son, the future of my family. Without him, everything I have built, everything my family has been for 7 generations, it would all be meaningless. You gave that back to me. You cannot possibly expect me to just let you walk away into the night with nothing. I expect nothing from you, Your Grace. I never have. That is how I have survived. Then learn to expect more. Matthias moved to block the door. Stay, please. At least until Alexander is fully recovered. I can give you safety here. Food, a warm bed, protection from anyone who might be hunting you. And he paused, something occurring to him. And perhaps you can teach me, teach us, how you knew what to do, how you healed him. Ezra looked at him for a long moment with those ancient, knowing eyes. Your physicians will never learn from me, Your Grace. I am a child. I am black. I am a runaway slave. They will say I practiced dark magic. They will say I got lucky. They will say anything and everything to avoid admitting that their learning is incomplete, that there are things in this world they do not understand. Then to hell with them, Matthias said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. To hell with every last one of them. You saved my son when they condemned him to death. That is all the proof I need. But they have power, Your Grace, influence. They can make trouble for you if you openly reject their authority. Let them try. Matthias's smile was cold and sharp. I am the Duke of Blackthorn. I have power too, and I choose to use it to protect the boy who saved my son. Stay, Ezra. Please. For the first time since he had entered the nursery, Ezra looked uncertain. His gaze moved past Matthias to the cradle, to Alexander sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, to Rosalind, who was watching him with an expression of desperate gratitude. I will stay, he said finally, his voice very quiet. But only until the young master is fully recovered. After that, I must go. It is not safe for me to remain in one place too long. There are too many people looking. Too much money offered for my return. We'll see about that, Matthias said. Mrs. Heaton? The housekeeper, who had been standing silently in the corridor, stepped forward. Yes, Your Grace? Prepare a room for our guest. One of the better guest rooms, not the servants' quarters. Mrs. Heaton's eyes widened, but she nodded immediately. Yes, Your Grace. And have cook prepare a proper meal. A large one. The boy looks like he hasn't eaten in days. 3 days, actually, Ezra said quietly. It has been 3 days since my last meal. Matthias felt something twist in his chest. Shame, perhaps, or recognition of his own privilege that he had never before questioned. 3 days. This child had been starving for 3 days, and yet he had come here and saved Alexander's life, asking for nothing in return. You will eat tonight, Matthias said, and his voice was softer now, gentler. A full meal, as much as you want, and you will have a warm bath and clean clothes and a soft bed. That is not negotiable. Do you understand? For the first time, a faint smile touched Ezra's lips. It transformed his face, made him look younger, more like the child he actually was rather than the ancient soul he carried. Yes, Your Grace, I understand. Good. Matthias stepped aside from the door. Mrs. Heaton, please take care of our guest. Make sure he has everything he needs. After they left, Matthias stood alone in the nursery with his wife and son. Rosalind had settled into the rocking chair by the fire, Alexander cradled against her chest, nursing contentedly. The baby's skin was pink and healthy. His breathing was steady and strong. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were clear and bright. Alive. I don't understand what just happened, Rosalind said softly, her voice filled with wonder. How is this possible? How did a child succeed, where all those learned men failed? I don't know, Matthias admitted. He moved to kneel beside her chair, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. Alexander's fingers wrapped around his thumb instinctively, that automatic infant reflex, and Matthias felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in years. But I intend to find out. He looked at his wife, this woman he had married for duty and alliance, but who had become something more to him over the years. Rosalind, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. What is it? That boy, Ezra, he's a runaway slave. He admitted it freely. By law, I should turn him in. The reward money for his return would be substantial, and there would be no legal consequences for me. In fact, I might be praised for doing my civic duty. Rosalind's arms tightened protectively around Alexander. You're not actually considering that. Please tell me you're not. No. Matthias shook his head. God help me, no. I couldn't possibly. Not after what he did. But Rosalind, if I help him, if I protect him, there will be consequences. The man who claims to own him will not give up easily. There could be legal battles, social repercussions. We could be ostracized by society for harboring a fugitive. I don't care. Her voice was fierce. That boy saved our son. He gave us back our miracle. I don't care what society thinks. I don't care about the law. If you try to turn him in, Matthias, I swear to God, I will never forgive you. He smiled at her, a real smile, the first genuine smile he had managed in days. I was hoping you would say that. So what will you do? I don't know yet, Matthias admitted, but I know this. That boy has knowledge that could save countless lives. Children dying of fevers, women suffering through difficult births, men with lung sickness from the mines. If what he knows could be taught, could be shared. He paused, the idea forming even as he spoke. Perhaps this is an opportunity, not just to save one life, but many. You want him to stay, Rosalind said, understanding. Not just until Alexander is well. You want him to stay permanently. Would that be so wrong? She looked down at their son, at the baby who had been dying just an hour ago and was now nursing contentedly, alive and healthy and perfect. No, she said softly. It wouldn't be wrong at all. It might be the most right thing either of us has ever done. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the peaceful sounds of Alexander's feeding, watching the firelight dance across his tiny face. And Matthias thought about the strange turn his life had taken tonight. He had started this evening as a man who believed in order, in hierarchy, in the natural superiority of education and breeding and social position. He had ended it humbled by a poor, hungry, ragged child who possessed knowledge and courage that no amount of money or titles could buy. Perhaps Ezra had been right. Perhaps tonight had taught him something. Perhaps it would make him better. Or perhaps, Matthias thought with a hint of his old irony, perhaps it would make him dangerous. Because a duke who had learned to question the established order, to see beyond the boundaries of his own privilege, that was a man who could change things. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what England needed. The days that followed were strange beyond measure. Ezra remained in the manor, true to his word, overseeing Alexander's recovery with the focused intensity of someone far older than his years. He taught the nursemaid, Mary, how to perform the gentle percussion on the baby's back, the rhythm, the pressure, the exact locations that would help the lungs clear themselves most effectively. He showed Cook how to prepare the herbal infusions that would strengthen Alexander's lungs and boost his constitution. The recipes were complex, requiring precise measurements and specific preparation methods that Cook had never encountered in all her years of kitchen work. You steep the ginger in boiling water for exactly 7 minutes, Ezra explained patiently, demonstrating in the manor's kitchen, while Cook and her staff watched with varying expressions of skepticism and fascination. Not 5, not 10. 7. Too short, and it won't release the full medicinal properties. Too long, and it becomes too strong, too harsh for an infant's stomach. He added honey to the mixture, stirring it carefully. The honey must be raw, unprocessed. The heat destroys some of its healing properties, but enough remain if you add it after the water has cooled slightly. And this, he pulled a small cloth bag from his pocket, filled with dried leaves. This is what my grandmother called healing leaf. You call it something else here, I think. Lungwort, perhaps. Cook peered at it suspiciously. Lungwort? That's a weed, boy. Grows in the marshes. Yes, Ezra agreed. And it is also medicine, one of the most powerful remedies for lung ailments that exists. But your doctors do not use it because it is common, because it grows wild, because it costs nothing. They prefer expensive treatments, exotic ingredients, things that make them seem important. That's a bold claim, Cook said, but there was no malice in her voice, only a kind of grudging respect. It is a true claim, Ezra corrected gently. The young master's recovery will prove it. And it did. Alexander improved rapidly, almost miraculously. Within 3 days, the baby was nursing normally, his tiny face animated and alert. Within a week, he was babbling and grasping at toys with his chubby fingers, his eyes following movement around the nursery. Within 2 weeks, he was laughing, a gurgling, joyful sound that brought tears to Rosalind's eyes because she had thought she would never hear it. I thought I had lost him, she confessed to Ezra one afternoon, as they sat together in the nursery, watching Alexander play with a silver rattle. I had already mourned him in my heart. I had already imagined his funeral, his burial, the empty years ahead without him. And then you came. I'm glad I could help, my lady. Help? She laughed softly, shaking her head. You did more than help, Ezra. You performed a miracle. You gave me back my son when God himself seemed to have abandoned us. God did not abandon you, Ezra said quietly. He simply sent help in a form you did not expect. Rosalind looked at him curiously. You are Christian then? My people were Christian before the slavers came. Missionaries had been in our region for many years. We went to church, said our prayers, believed in salvation and grace. His voice was neutral, neither bitter nor nostalgic. Though I confess, after being stolen from my home and sold like an animal, I found my faith complicated. I cannot imagine what you have endured. No, my lady, you cannot. It was not said unkindly, simply as a statement of fact. But that is not your fault. You were born to privilege, just as I was born to a fishing village on the Gold Coast. Neither of us chose our circumstances. We simply live with them as best we can. But while Ezra's presence brought hope and healing to the nursery, it created other complications elsewhere in the manor. The servants whispered. Some were grateful. Mrs. Heaton sang the boy's praises to anyone who would listen, telling the story of the miraculous healing over and over again, with growing embellishment. 18 doctors, and not one of them worth the paper their fancy degrees were printed on, she would say, arms crossed firmly over her chest. But that boy, that wonderful boy, he knew exactly what to do. Saved the young master's life, he did, and don't let anyone tell you different. But others were suspicious, frightened even. They crossed themselves when Ezra passed in the corridors, as if warding off evil. They claimed his healing was unnatural, that he must have made a pact with dark forces, that no mere child, especially not one of his race, one of his background, could possess such knowledge without supernatural aid. It's witchcraft, one of the footmen muttered darkly to his fellows. Mark my words, that boy is in league with the devil. Probably sacrificed a goat or some such thing. You can't tell me there's any natural explanation for what he did. Don't be daft, another footman replied. Mrs. Heaton was there. She saw everything. He used water and herbs and gentle touch. Nothing more. If that's witchcraft, then every grandmother in England is a witch. Maybe they are, the first footman said stubbornly. Maybe that's exactly what they are. The whispers reached Matthias, of course. Everything that happened in his household eventually reached his ears. He was not pleased. If I hear one more word about witchcraft or dark magic, or any other such nonsense, he announced to the assembled staff one morning in the servants' hall, his voice cold and authoritative. That person will be dismissed immediately without reference. Is that clear? There were murmurs of assent, bowed heads, averted eyes. Ezra saved my son's life through knowledge and skill, Matthias continued. Nothing more, nothing less. If that makes some of you uncomfortable, if that challenges your prejudices and assumptions, then that is your problem to solve, not his. He is under my protection. Anyone who treats him with anything less than respect will answer to me personally. Am I understood? Yes, Your Grace, came the chorus of replies. But Matthias knew that words alone would not change deeply held beliefs. Fear and superstition ran deep, especially in servants who had never ventured far from Lancashire and whose understanding of the world was shaped by gossip and rumor rather than experience. It would take time. And perhaps it would take more than time. Perhaps it would take education. The physicians, when they heard what had happened, were outraged. Dr. Pemberton actually returned to Blackthorn Manor a week after Alexander's recovery, arriving in his expensive carriage, his face red with indignation. Your Grace, he announced, barely waiting to be admitted to Matthias's study before launching into his tirade. I have heard the most alarming reports. They say you allowed an uneducated child, a child, Your Grace, to treat your son, to interfere with established medical protocols, to practice medicine without any training or credentials whatsoever. "The child saved my son's life," Matthias replied coldly, not bothering to rise from behind his desk. "Which is more than you or any of your colleagues managed to accomplish. But, Your Grace, you cannot possibly believe that he succeeded through legitimate medical means. It is far more likely, far more scientifically probable, that the fever simply ran its course naturally, and the boy happened to be present when the child's constitution finally overcame the illness on its own." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Matthias leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes hard and mocking. "That my son miraculously recovered exactly when Ezra began treating him, entirely by coincidence. That the methods he used, clearing the lungs, cooling the fever, providing gentle nutrition, had nothing whatsoever to do with Alexander's survival? I'm saying, Your Grace, that correlation is not causation. The boy may have performed certain actions, but that doesn't prove those actions were responsible for the recovery. No, what it proves is that you and your colleagues know far less than you claim to know." Matthias rose now, moving around the desk to stand directly in front of Pemberton. He was taller than the doctor, and he used his height deliberately, intimidatingly. "You stood in my nursery and told me my son would be dead by morning. You told me there was nothing more to be done. You collected your exorbitant fee, and you left. I did everything medical science could recommend. You did everything your limited understanding could conceive of," Matthias corrected. "And it was not enough. Ezra, with his grandmother's traditional knowledge, succeeded where you failed. That is an uncomfortable truth for you, I'm sure. But it is truth nonetheless." Pemberton's face had gone purple. "Your Grace, I must protest. You are dismissed, Dr. Pemberton." Matthias's voice was cold and final. "I will not be requiring your services in the future, or the services of any of your colleagues who claim to know so much, yet accomplish so little. You cannot. This is highly irregular. The medical community will—" "The medical community can go to hell," Matthias said calmly. "Along with you. Good day." After Pemberton left, sputtering with rage, Matthias stood at the window of his study and looked out over the snow-covered grounds of his estate. He was aware that he was burning bridges, that he was making enemies in the medical establishment, that his actions would be seen as radical, even dangerous. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. His son was alive because a poor, desperate, brilliant boy had possessed courage and knowledge that all the educated men in England lacked. That said something profound about the world Matthias lived in, about the systems and hierarchies he had always taken for granted. Perhaps it was time those systems were questioned. Perhaps it was time for something new. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Ezra entered, looking cleaner and healthier than he had when he first arrived. Mrs. Heaton had taken it upon herself to ensure the boy was properly fed and clothed, and the transformation was remarkable. He was still thin, still carried that ancient weight in his eyes, but there was color in his cheeks now, and the coal dust had been scrubbed from his skin and hair. "Your Grace," Ezra said quietly, "the young master is sleeping well. His lungs are completely clear now. The fever has not returned. In another few days, he will be fully recovered." "Thank you," Matthias said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Please, sit." Ezra hesitated, then took the chair Matthias indicated. He still looked uncomfortable sitting in the presence of a duke, as if expecting to be dismissed or punished at any moment. "I want to ask you something," Matthias said, returning to his own chair behind the desk. "And I want you to be completely honest with me, even if you think the answer might displease me." "Of course, Your Grace." "How did you learn these things? Your grandmother taught you, you said. But that cannot be the whole story. You're too young, too knowledgeable. There must be more." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far away in time and space. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. My grandmother was a healer in our village. Not just any healer. She was what her mother called a medicine woman, someone who carried the knowledge of generations. She learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, going back so far that no one remembered when it began. The knowledge is passed down, mother to daughter usually, though sometimes to others who show the gift. He paused, his fingers tracing patterns on the arm of the chair. I was not supposed to learn it. I am male, and traditionally, this knowledge was women's work. But my mother died when I was very young, too young for her to begin teaching me. And my grandmother had no daughters, no granddaughters. So she made an exception. She said I had the gift, that I saw things others missed, that I listened in the way a healer must listen. What kind of things did she teach you? Everything. Ezra's voice took on a quality of reverence, of love. How to read the body's signs, the color of the skin, the quality of the pulse, the pattern of breathing, the look of the tongue and eyes. How to recognize hundreds of different illnesses by their subtle differences. How to use plants and herbs and roots, which ones could heal and which ones could kill. How to prepare them, when to give them, how much. He looked up at Matthias. She taught me that the body is not separate from the mind or the spirit, that you cannot heal one without considering the others. Your English doctors treat the body like a broken machine. Replace this part, bleed out that fluid, cut away this growth. But a person is not a machine. A person is a whole thing, connected and alive and constantly changing. Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman, Matthias said quietly. She was. Ezra's voice caught slightly. She was everything. Teacher, protector, the wisest person I have ever known. When the slavers came, she tried to hide me. But there were too many of them, too well armed. They set fire to our village, drove everyone toward the beach where the ships waited. His voice had gone flat now, emotionless, the way people speak when describing trauma too great to fully feel. She ran after me. I was being dragged toward the boats, and she ran after me. This old woman, running and screaming. They struck her. One of the slavers struck her with the butt of his gun, and she fell. Ezra's hands clenched into fists. I do not know if she died that day or later. I do not know if she was one of the ones they took aboard the ship because she was strong enough to survive the voyage, or if they left her bleeding on the beach. I will never know. And that not knowing, is almost worse than if I had seen her die. I'm sorry, Matthias said, and the words felt horribly inadequate. Many are sorry, Ezra replied, his ancient eyes meeting Matthias's. But sorry does not bring her back. Sorry does not undo what was done. Sorry is just a word that costs nothing and changes nothing. Then what would change things? Matthias leaned forward. Tell me, what would actually matter? Ezra looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something, making a decision about how much truth to speak. Then he said, You. Me? You, Your Grace. You have power that I will never have. You have wealth, connections, influence. You could speak out against the slave trade. You could use your position in Parliament to support abolition. You could use your money to help people like me. Runaways who are hunted. Families that have been torn apart. Children who have been stolen from their homes and sold. The slave trade is already illegal in England, Matthias pointed out. But not in your colonies, Ezra countered. Not in the places where the ships still sail, where people are still bought and sold, where families are still destroyed. And even in England, even here, where slavery is supposedly abolished, men like the one who owned the ship that brought me here can still claim me as property under maritime law, can still hunt me down and drag me back in chains. His voice had grown passionate now, the first real emotion Matthias had heard from him, beyond that terrible flat tone when speaking of his grandmother. You ask what would matter. Action would matter. Not words. Not sympathy. Action. Using your power to change laws, to protect people, to make it so that what happened to me cannot happen to others. Matthias sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the boy's words. What Ezra was asking for was not small. It was political, dangerous, likely to make him enemies among his fellow aristocrats, many of whom profited from the trade either directly or indirectly. But looking at this boy, this brilliant, brave, extraordinary boy who had saved his son's life and asked for nothing except justice, Matthias felt something shift in his chest. You said you would leave when Alexander was fully recovered, he said. Yes. What if I asked you to stay longer? Permanently even? Ezra shook his head. Your Grace, we have discussed this. It is not safe. Already your servants fear me. Already your doctors hate me. And there are men looking for runaways, men who would search even a duke's manor if they had reason to believe I was here. What if I could protect you? Matthias leaned forward, his voice intense. Not just from the men hunting you, but legally. What if I could give you true freedom, recognized by law, so that no one could ever claim you as property again? You cannot do that. The law does not work that way. The law can be changed, Matthias said. It's difficult. It requires effort and influence and strategic alliances, but it can be done. I have friends in Parliament. I have judges who owe me favors. I have connections that reach all the way to the Prime Minister himself. He stood and began to pace, his mind already working through the possibilities. If the man who claims to own you challenges my protection, we take it to court. We make it a public case. We force them to rule on whether a person, a living, breathing, thinking person, can be considered property on English soil. We make them choose between their comfortable hypocrisy and the fundamental principles they claim to believe in. And if they rule against you, then we appeal, and we fight, and we make so much noise, create so much scandal, that Parliament has no choice but to address the contradiction in their laws. Matthias stopped pacing and looked directly at Ezra. I cannot promise success. I cannot promise it will be easy or quick or without cost. But I can promise to try, to use every ounce of my power and influence to secure your freedom. Why? Ezra asked, the same question he had asked before. Why would you do this for me? Because you saved my son, Matthias said simply, and because you're right. I have power that I have never really examined, never questioned how I use it or what it's for. Perhaps it's time I used it for something that actually matters. He sat back down, his gray eyes intense. But there's another reason too. The knowledge you have, what your grandmother taught you. It could save countless lives. Children dying of fevers like Alexander, women suffering through difficult births, men with lung sickness from working in the mines. All of them could be helped if what you know, were taught, were shared. Your physicians will never learn from me, Ezra said. I have told you this. Then perhaps we need different physicians. Matthias smiled, and there was something dangerous in it, something revolutionary. What if we started a school? A new kind of medical training that combines the best of English science with the best of traditional healing? A place where people like you could teach alongside university-educated doctors? Ezra stared at him. That would be unprecedented. Yes, Matthias agreed. It would, and it would be controversial and difficult, and probably make me a lot of enemies. But it would also be right. It would save lives. And isn't that what medicine is supposed to be about? For the first time since entering the study, Ezra smiled, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look like the child he actually was. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Your Grace." "Perhaps both," Matthias admitted. "But I am also determined. So I ask you again, will you stay? Not just until Alexander is recovered, but for the long term. Will you help me build something new?" Ezra was quiet for a long time, his ancient eyes searching Matthias's face as if looking for deception or hidden motives. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I will stay, but on one condition." "Name it." "Teach me," Ezra said, his voice suddenly young and hungry and full of longing. "Teach me to read and write in English, properly. Teach me the learning your world values: Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, literature. I can speak English well enough because I learned it on the ship, listening to the sailors. But I cannot read it well. I cannot write. If I am to survive in your world, if I am to teach others, I must be able to speak their language in every way." "You want education," Matthias said, understanding. "I want knowledge," Ezra corrected. "I have knowledge that they do not. Knowledge of healing, of the body, of traditional medicine. But they have knowledge I do not. Knowledge of books and laws and the ways of power. If I can learn what they know, while keeping what I know, then perhaps I can bridge the gap. Perhaps I can translate between worlds." Matthias felt something like respect settle in his chest, deeper and more profound than anything he had felt for any of his aristocratic peers. This boy, this extraordinary boy, understood the game better than most adults. He understood that knowledge was power, that to survive and thrive in England, he would need to master its systems while never forgetting where he came from. "Done," Matthias said firmly. "I will tutor you myself. I was educated at Oxford. I am more than capable of teaching you everything you want to learn. And in return, you will teach me your healing arts. Not to practice them myself. I have no talent for such things. But to understand them. To be able to defend them when others call them superstition or worse." He extended his hand across the desk. "Do we have an agreement?" Ezra looked at the outstretched hand for a moment, and Matthias saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or disbelief that a duke would offer a handshake to someone like him, someone who was legally considered property by many, someone whose life had been worth nothing to the men who had stolen him from his home. Then, slowly, Ezra reached out and clasped Matthias's hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused from hard work. "We have an agreement, Your Grace." And in that moment, in that simple handshake, something changed. Not just for Ezra and Matthias, but for everyone whose lives they would touch in the years to come. The months that followed transformed Blackthorn Manor in ways no one could have predicted. Ezra moved from the guest room to a permanent chamber near the library, not as a servant, but as something unprecedented. Not quite family, not quite ward, not quite apprentice. The household struggled to categorize him, which meant he occupied a strange, liminal space that made everyone uncomfortable in different ways. True to his word, Matthias tutored the boy every morning in his study. They would begin at 7 o'clock after breakfast and work straight through until noon, with only a brief break for tea. And Matthias discovered something that both delighted and humbled him. Ezra was brilliant. Not just intelligent, but brilliant in a way that defied easy explanation. He absorbed languages like a sponge, spoke basic Latin within 3 months, could discuss Greek philosophy within 6. His mathematical mind was extraordinary. He saw patterns and connections that even Matthias, who had been an excellent student at Oxford, sometimes missed. "How do you do that?" Matthias asked one morning, watching as Ezra worked through a complex geometry problem that had taken Matthias himself several minutes to solve. The boy had completed it in less than a minute. Do what, Your Grace? See the answer so quickly. Most students would need to work through multiple steps, test different approaches. You just see it. Ezra looked up from the slate where he'd been writing his solution. I do not know how to explain it. The patterns just appear, like when I look at a sick person and see what is wrong with them. It is not something I think about exactly. It is something I perceive. Perhaps. That's what genius is, Matthias mused. Not thinking harder than others, but perceiving what others cannot see. But the real education went both ways. In the afternoons, Ezra taught Matthias his healing arts. They would walk through the manor's extensive gardens, even in winter, as Ezra pointed out plants and herbs that grew wild among the ornamental flowers. This one you call nettle, Ezra would say, gesturing to a patch of the stinging plant that the gardeners usually tried to eradicate. You see it as a weed, something to be pulled and burned. But it is medicine, powerful medicine. Tea made from nettle helps with inflammation, strengthens the blood, eases joint pain in the elderly. How do you prepare it without getting stung? Matthias asked, eyeing the plant warily. Carefully, Ezra said with a slight smile. And you wear gloves. The sting is in the fresh leaves. Once they are dried or cooked, they are harmless. My grandmother would make nettle soup when someone was recovering from illness. It gave them strength. He knelt beside another plant, this one with small purple flowers. And this is self-heal. Again, you probably see it as a weed. But it stops bleeding, helps wounds close cleanly, prevents infection. Crushed and applied directly to a cut, it works better than most of your English ointments. Matthias found himself fascinated by this hidden world of medicine that had been growing right under his nose all along, dismissed as weeds and superstition. Why don't our doctors use these things? Because they are free, Ezra said simply. They grow wild. Anyone can harvest them. There is no money to be made, no prestige to be gained. Your doctors prefer expensive treatments, exotic ingredients shipped from distant lands, complex procedures that only they can perform. It makes them feel important, makes them seem worth their high fees. That's rather cynical. That is rather true, Ezra corrected gently. I do not say this to be cruel, Your Grace. I am sure many of your doctors genuinely believe in what they do. But they are also men with livelihoods to protect, reputations to maintain. They cannot easily admit that much of what they learned in their expensive universities is incomplete or even wrong. Word of Ezra's abilities spread through the countryside, despite Matthias's attempts to keep things quiet. Servants talked to their families in the village. Families talked to neighbors. Soon, people began appearing at the manor's gates, hoping for help. A farmer's wife came, weeping, leading her 12-year-old daughter, who had been coughing blood for weeks. The local doctor had diagnosed consumption and said the girl would be dead within a month. Ezra examined her carefully, listening to her breathing, checking her skin and eyes and tongue. Then he asked questions the doctor had never thought to ask. What did she eat? Where did she sleep? Had anything changed in her environment recently? It turned out the family had recently moved the girl's bed to a damp corner of their cottage, directly beneath a leaking section of roof. The constant dampness had bred mold, which the girl had been breathing every night. Move her bed to a dry location, Ezra instructed, far from any dampness or mold, and give her this. He prepared a mixture of honey, ginger, and herbs, 3 times daily. Her lungs are inflamed, not diseased. They will heal if given proper conditions and support. Within days, the girl's coughing stopped. Within 2 weeks, she was fully recovered. A miner was brought to the manor on a crude stretcher, his leg crushed in a pit collapse. The local surgeon wanted to amputate immediately. The leg was badly damaged. Infection was almost certain. Better to lose the limb than the life. But Ezra convinced them to wait. He cleaned the wounds meticulously with salt water and strong spirits. He used poultices made from honey and herbs to draw out infection and reduce swelling. He splinted the leg carefully, keeping the bones aligned, and taught the man's wife how to care for it properly. It was a near thing. Fever came and went. There were moments when amputation seemed inevitable. But Ezra stayed with the miner for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, adjusting the treatment as needed. The leg was saved. The miner would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. A woman arrived at the manor in the middle of the night, 8 months pregnant and in difficult labor. The baby was breech, stuck, and the local midwife was in tears, certain both mother and child would die. Matthias sent for Ezra immediately, and the boy arrived in the birthing room still half asleep, his hair disheveled. But the moment he saw the situation, he became completely focused. "I need to turn the baby," he said calmly. "From the outside, before it enters the birth canal. It is risky, but less risky than cutting her open." "You're going to perform a manual rotation?" the midwife gasped. "But you're a child. You can't possibly." "I have done this twice before," Ezra said quietly, "with my grandmother. I know what I am doing. But I need you to help me, to hold her steady, to encourage her, to time her contractions, so I can work with them rather than against them." It took nearly an hour of careful, gentle manipulation. Ezra's hands on the woman's swollen belly, feeling for the baby's position, coaxing it slowly around. The mother screamed with pain despite their efforts to be gentle, but she trusted them, followed their instructions. Finally, Ezra stepped back, sweat dripping down his face. "The baby is in position. Now, we let nature take its course." 2 hours later, a healthy baby boy entered the world. The mother survived. The midwife wept with relief and gratitude. Each success brought more people, and more complications. The local doctor, a pompous man named Dr. Grimsby, was furious. He wrote angry letters to the medical board, complaining that his practice was being undermined by superstition and quackery practiced by an uneducated child. The Anglican vicar, Father Michaels, was deeply troubled. He came to Blackthorn Manor to speak with Matthias, his face grave with concern. "Your Grace, I must speak plainly. There are rumors, disturbing rumors, that the boy in your care practices dark arts, that his healings are unnatural, perhaps even demonic in origin." "They are not demonic," Matthias said coldly. "They are based on traditional knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that your church, frankly, has spent centuries trying to destroy because it threatens your monopoly on wisdom." Father Michaels looked shocked. "Your Grace, surely you don't believe. I believe what I have seen with my own eyes. Ezra saved my son's life when 18 trained physicians failed. He has since saved dozens of other lives, using nothing more than plants, water, gentle touch, and knowledge. If that is witchcraft, Father, then perhaps we need more witches and fewer priests." The vicar left, shaken and angry, and Matthias knew there would be consequences. But he found he didn't care. The old certainties of his life, the unquestioning acceptance of established authorities, the belief that education and social position equaled knowledge and wisdom, had been shattered. He had seen truth lived out in the thin, scarred hands of a 13-year-old boy. And that truth was more compelling than anything the doctors or the church could offer. But the most dangerous threat came 6 months after Ezra's arrival. Matthias was in his study one evening, reviewing estate accounts, when his butler entered with an expression of deep concern. "Your Grace, there are men here to see you. They claim to have legal business of the utmost importance." What kind of legal business? Matthias felt tension coil in his stomach. They would not say specifically, Your Grace, but the butler hesitated. They asked specifically about the boy, about Ezra. Matthias felt ice slide down his spine. Show them in. 2 men entered his study. The first was clearly a lawyer. Expensive suit, leather portfolio, the carefully cultivated expression of professional neutrality that lawyers wore like armor. The second was harder to categorize. Well-dressed in the manner of a successful merchant, but there was something rough about him, something that spoke of violence, barely concealed beneath the veneer of respectability. Your Grace. The lawyer bowed with precise courtesy. My name is Clement Ashford. I am a barrister from Liverpool, and I represent Mr. James Hartwick here. He gestured to the other man. We are here on a matter of some delicacy. Matthias studied Hartwick carefully. The man had cold blue eyes, a hard mouth, and hands that looked like they had seen physical labor before money elevated him. State your business. Very well. Ashford opened his portfolio and extracted several documents. We have come to reclaim stolen property that is currently being harbored on your estate, specifically a runaway slave known as Ezra. Mr. Hartwick purchased this individual as part of a cargo manifest in December of 1840, during a legitimate transaction in Cape Coast. The boy was transported on Mr. Hartwick's vessel, the Meridian, and escaped when the ship docked in Liverpool for repairs in March of 1841. He laid the documents on Matthias's desk. These are the bills of sale, properly notarized and witnessed. This is the ship's manifest, showing the cargo, including human cargo, that was purchased. And these are affidavits from multiple witnesses, placing the boy, called Ezra, on this estate. Matthias looked at the papers, but did not touch them. I am aware that slavery is illegal in England, Mr. Ashford. Ah, but this is where the law becomes complex, Your Grace. Ashford's smile was thin and professional. You are correct that the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 outlawed slavery in most British colonies. However, maritime law is a different matter entirely. The Meridian was registered under a Portuguese flag. The transaction occurred in international waters. Under the laws of admiralty, the cargo, including the boy, remained Mr. Hartwick's legal property throughout the voyage. He escaped on English soil, Matthias pointed out. Yes, but the property rights established during the voyage remain valid under maritime law. Mr. Hartwick has every legal right to reclaim what belongs to him. Hartwick spoke for the first time, his voice rough and direct. Look, Your Grace, I'm a reasonable man. I understand you may have grown attached to the lad. He's useful, I'm sure. Bit of carpentry, grounds work, whatever. And I'm willing to be generous about this. I'll pay you fair compensation for the inconvenience of his retrieval. Say, £20? That's more than generous for a runaway. Matthias felt rage building in his chest, white-hot and barely controlled. He's not for sale. Your Grace, Ashford began. He's not for sale, Matthias repeated, his voice quiet and deadly, because he is not property. Ezra is a human being, a person. He lives in this house as my ward, under my protection. And if you attempt to take him, you will be forcibly removed from my estate. Hartwick's face darkened. Now see here. No, you see here. Matthias stood, using his full height, his full authority. I don't care what papers you have. I don't care what maritime laws you think apply. That boy saved my son's life. He has saved dozens of other lives since coming here, and I will be damned, literally damned, before I let you drag him back into slavery. Your Grace, you are making a serious legal error. Ashford's professional composure was beginning to crack. Mr. Hartwick has every right. Mr. Hartwick has no rights here. Matthias moved to the door and opened it. His butler and 2 footmen stood waiting. Clearly, the butler had anticipated trouble. "Gentlemen, please escort these visitors off my property. If they resist, you have my permission to use whatever force is necessary." Ashford's face went red. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. We will take this matter to court. We will sue for recovery of property and damages." "Then sue," Matthias said coldly. "Take it to court. Bring every lawyer in England if you wish. I will fight you every step of the way. And I assure you, Mr. Ashford, my legal resources are considerably more extensive than yours." "The law is on our side." "We shall see about that." Matthias gestured to the footmen. "Remove them. Now." Hartwick resisted for a moment, his hand moving toward his coat, as if reaching for a weapon. But the footmen were large men, former soldiers who worked for Matthias precisely because they could handle difficult situations. They moved in smoothly, professionally, and within moments, both Hartwick and Ashford were being escorted down the corridor. "This isn't over," Hartwick shouted as they forced him toward the door. "You're making an enemy you'll regret, Your Grace. I'll take everything you have. The door slammed shut, cutting off his threats. Matthias stood alone in his study, his hands shaking with suppressed rage and something that might have been fear. He knew this was not over. Men like Hartwick did not give up easily, especially when money was involved. And Ashford had been right about one thing. The law in this area was complex, contradictory, full of gaps and ambiguities that clever lawyers could exploit. This was going to be a fight, a long, difficult, public fight. And he needed to warn Ezra. He found the boy in the library, reading by candlelight. Ezra had taken to spending his evenings there, working his way systematically through Matthias's extensive book collection. Currently, he was deep in a volume of Greek philosophy, his finger tracing the words as he sounded them out. He looked up as Matthias entered, and immediately his ancient eyes narrowed. "What has happened?" "The man who owned the ship that brought you here," Matthias said without preamble. "He's found you. He came here tonight with a lawyer, claiming legal right to take you back." Ezra closed the book carefully, his face going very still. "I should leave." "No." "Your Grace, I cannot bring this trouble to your house." "I said no." Matthias sat down heavily in the chair across from Ezra. "I made you a promise when I asked you to stay. I told you I would protect you. I meant it. But you cannot fight the law. Watch me." Matthias leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "Listen to me, Ezra. I am the Duke of Blackthorn. I have friends in Parliament. I have judges who owe me favors. I have connections that reach all the way to the Prime Minister himself. If Hartwick wants a legal fight, I will give him one he'll never forget." "But why?" Ezra's voice was anguished. "Why would you risk so much for me? Your reputation, your standing in society, possibly your wealth if the legal battle goes badly. Why?" Matthias looked at this boy, this brilliant, brave, impossible boy who had saved his son's life and asked for nothing in return. And he realized that the answer was both simple and profound. "Because you matter, Ezra. Your life matters. Your knowledge matters. Your freedom matters. And if I, with all my power and privilege, will not stand up for that, then what good is any of it? What good is being a duke if I cannot protect one child from injustice?" He paused, then continued more quietly. "And because you were right, that first day, when you said I was a man who would give anything to save my son. You understood that a father's love is more powerful than pride, or prejudice, or social convention. Well, I have learned something from you in these months. I have learned that some things are more important than following the rules, more important than maintaining respectability. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is dangerous. Tears shone in Ezra's eyes, but he blinked them back. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Don't thank me yet. This is only the beginning." And Matthias was right. The fight was brutal and protracted. Hartwick filed suit in Liverpool court 3 weeks later, claiming ownership of Ezra and demanding his immediate return. The case quickly became a sensation. Newspapers covered it extensively. Society talked of nothing else. Public opinion split sharply along class and political lines. Some supported Matthias, praising him for protecting a child. The more progressive papers ran editorials titled "The Duke's Courage" and "One Man Against Injustice." They printed testimonies from the people Ezra had healed, stories of miracles performed in Blackthorn Manor. Others condemned him viciously. Conservative publications called him a radical, a threat to property rights, a dangerous revolutionary who would undermine the foundations of English society. If a duke can simply refuse to respect legitimate ownership, one editorial thundered, what prevents common thieves from claiming the same privilege? The medical establishment was nearly unanimous in their condemnation. The Royal College of Physicians issued a statement expressing grave concern about unlicensed medical practice being condoned by a peer of the realm. Dr. Pemberton wrote a widely circulated letter calling Matthias a dupe and a fool, taken in by cheap tricks and childish superstition. The church was divided. Some clergy supported Matthias, citing Christian principles of mercy and protection of the weak. Others declared him a heretic who harbored a witch. The trial began in June of 1843, more than a year after Ezra had first arrived at Blackthorn Manor. Hartwick's legal team was formidable. They produced documents proving purchase, witness testimony placing Ezra on the meridian, expert opinions on the legality of the transaction under maritime law. They argued that ownership rights, once established, could not be simply dismissed because they were morally uncomfortable. English law is built on the sanctity of property rights, Ashford thundered in his opening statement. If we allow those rights to be violated based on sentiment and emotion, if we permit a duke to simply refuse to return stolen property because he has grown fond of it, we open the door to chaos. Every contract becomes meaningless. Every transaction becomes suspect. The entire foundation of commerce crumbles. Matthias's legal team countered with arguments based on English common law and fundamental human rights. They produced Ezra himself, no longer a ragged, starving child, but a well-dressed, articulate young man who spoke Latin, read Greek, and could discuss philosophy and mathematics at a university level. "Look at him," Matthias's lead barrister, a brilliant young man named Edmund Price, said to the courtroom. "Look at this person and tell me, with a straight face, that he is property, that he is cargo, that he can be bought and sold like a sack of grain or a piece of furniture." They brought in witnesses, dozens of them. The farmer's wife, whose daughter Ezra had saved from consumption. The miner who still walked despite his crushed leg. The mother whose baby Ezra had delivered safely. Mrs. Heaton, who testified tearfully about the night Alexander had been dying and 18 doctors had failed. "That boy," she said, pointing at Ezra, her voice shaking with emotion. "That wonderful boy performed a miracle. He brought the young master back from death's door with nothing but knowledge and care and gentle hands. And you want to send him back to slavery? You want to put him in chains? What kind of people are we if we allow that?" The trial lasted 3 months, and the turning point came when Matthias himself took the stand. Dukes did not testify in court. It was beneath their dignity, a violation of the unspoken rules that governed aristocratic life. But Matthias had insisted he would speak for Ezra himself. He wore his full ducal regalia, not to impress, but to make a point, to show that he was willing to stake his entire position, his entire identity as a duke on this case. "I am not a radical man," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "I have spent my life upholding tradition, respecting law, honoring the systems that built this nation. I believe in property rights. I believe in contracts. I believe in the rule of law." He paused, his gray eyes moving across the courtroom, meeting the gaze of the judge, the jury, the audience packed into every available seat. "But I have also learned something in the past year. I have learned that some laws are unjust. I have learned that tradition and custom and legal precedent are not enough to make something right. And I have learned that sometimes, a man must choose between following the law and following his conscience." He turned to look directly at Hartwick, who sat at the plaintiff's table looking smug and confident. "That man claims to own Ezra. He has papers. He has contracts. He has legal arguments that are, I am sure, technically correct under certain interpretations of maritime law." Matthias looked back at the judge. "But here is what I know. I know that Ezra is a human being. I know that he thinks and feels and loves and suffers just as I do, just as my son does, just as every person in this courtroom does. I know that he saved my son's life when 18 trained physicians told me there was no hope. And I know that if I allow him to be taken back into slavery, if I stand by and do nothing while a living, breathing, brilliant person is treated as property, then I am complicit in evil." His voice dropped lower, more intense. "So yes, I am harboring a fugitive. Yes, I am defying what Mr. Hartwick claims is his legal right. And I would do it again, without hesitation, because some things are more important than law. Justice is more important than law. Humanity is more important than law. And if this court rules against me, if you decide that Ezra is indeed property that can be reclaimed, then I will know with absolute certainty that the law is wrong, and wrong laws must be changed." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Hartwick's lawyer objected strenuously. But Matthias had said what he came to say. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that shook slightly. "We find in favor of the defendant, the Duke of Blackthorn. The plaintiff's claim of ownership is denied." The courtroom exploded with noise, cheering, shouting, arguments erupting on all sides. But Matthias barely heard it. He turned to find Ezra sitting beside Edmund Price, tears streaming down his face. "You're free," Matthias said quietly. "Truly free. By law." "I was always free," Ezra replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But now England agrees." They stood together in that chaotic courtroom, Duke and former slave, and something fundamental had shifted in both of them and in the world around them. Life at Blackthorn Manor settled into a new normal after the trial, though normal was perhaps the wrong word for what they had created. Ezra continued his studies with ferocious intensity, devouring books the way a starving man devours food. He was reading university-level texts now, engaging in debates about philosophy and science that sometimes left Matthias struggling to keep up. But he also continued his healing work, more openly, now that the legal threat had passed. People came from all over Lancashire seeking his help, and he turned no one away. The poor farmer and the wealthy merchant received the same care, the same attention, the same gentle expertise. Alexander grew strong and healthy, a laughing, bright-eyed toddler who adored Ezra and followed him everywhere. "Ezzy," he would cry, his chubby arms outstretched, and Ezra would scoop him up and carry him around the gardens, teaching him the names of plants and herbs. Rosalind had been transformed by the experience. The broken, grieving woman who had sat motionless in the nursery was gone, replaced by someone passionate and purposeful. She learned herbal medicine from Ezra, became his assistant in treating the sick who came to the manor. She found that she had a gift for it, a gentle touch, an intuitive understanding of how to comfort frightened patients. "I spent so many years feeling useless," she confessed to Matthias one evening as they sat together in their private sitting room. "I was just the Duke's wife. My only purpose was to produce an heir, and I had failed at that 3 times. But now I feel like I'm actually doing something that matters." "You always mattered," Matthias said gently. "Perhaps, but I didn't feel it. Not until Ezra showed me there was more to life than balls and gossip and managing the household staff." She smiled. "He's changed us all, hasn't he? You, me, even the servants. We're not the same people we were before he arrived." And she was right. Mrs. Heaton had started teaching the younger maids about healing herbs, passing on what she had learned from Ezra. The head gardener had dedicated an entire section of the grounds to medicinal plants, carefully cultivated, according to Ezra's instructions. Even the footmen had stopped making superstitious signs when Ezra passed and instead greeted him with respectful nods. But the real culmination of everything they had been building came 2 years after the trial, when Matthias made his most radical move yet. He used his influence in Parliament to push through funding for a new kind of medical school. Not a traditional institution focused solely on European medicine, but something unprecedented, a place where traditional healing knowledge from around the world would be studied alongside conventional medical science. The Blackthorn Academy of Integrated Medicine opened its doors in January of 1846. Ezra, now 16, was its youngest instructor. He taught alongside university-trained physicians, his classes always packed with students eager to learn these new techniques. The initial skepticism from the medical establishment gradually gave way to grudging respect as graduates of the academy proved remarkably skilled at treating conditions that traditional doctors struggled with. Matthias himself served as the academy's primary benefactor and public advocate. He used his position as a duke, his connections in government, to shield the school from critics and provide the resources it needed to thrive. "Are you satisfied?" he asked Ezra one evening as they stood together on the steps of the academy, watching students stream out after the day's classes. Ezra considered the question carefully. "Satisfied? No. There is too much work still to be done, too many people still suffering who could be helped. But am I hopeful?" He smiled. "Yes, Your Grace. For the first time in my life, I am genuinely hopeful." 5 years after Ezra first walked into Blackthorn Manor, Matthias stood in his study reviewing the school's first annual report. The numbers were remarkable. Hundreds of students trained, thousands of patients treated, a mortality rate significantly lower than traditional hospitals. He thought back to that desperate February night when his son lay dying, when 18 doctors had failed, when he had been on his knees begging a God he wasn't sure he believed in for mercy. And then Ezra had appeared, an impossible boy with impossible knowledge, asking for nothing and offering everything. Matthias had thought he was hiring a miracle worker. What he had actually found was something far more profound: a teacher, a friend, a moral compass that had forced him to question every assumption he'd ever held about power, privilege, and justice. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in." Ezra entered, no longer a thin, ragged child, but a young man of 17, tall and confident and educated. But his eyes still held that ancient quality, that weight of knowledge and experience that went far beyond his years. "Your Grace, I wanted to discuss the new curriculum proposal for next year. I think we should add—" He stopped, noticing Matthias's expression. "Is something wrong?" "No." Matthias smiled. "Actually, everything is right. I was just thinking about that night, when you first came here. The night I saved Alexander." "The night you saved all of us," Matthias corrected. Because you didn't just heal my son, Ezra. You healed our family, our household, perhaps even our society in some small way. Ezra moved to the window, looking out over the grounds. I never intended any of that. I just wanted to help one child. That's how all great changes begin, Matthias said quietly. One person, one moment, one act of courage. You were that person, Ezra. You changed the world by refusing to accept that children should die when knowledge existed to save them. We changed it together, Ezra corrected. I had the knowledge, but you had the power to protect it, to amplify it, to make it matter beyond just one sick child. Neither of us could have done it alone. Then we make a good team. We do, Your Grace. Ezra turned back from the window, and there was something like happiness in his ancient eyes. We truly do. Outside, in the nursery, 6-year-old Alexander played with his younger sister, both of them healthy and strong and gloriously alive. In the academy, students from all over England learned healing arts that would save countless lives. In the gardens, medicinal herbs grew alongside roses, both beautiful and useful. And in the study, 2 men stood together, Duke and former slave, teacher and student, bound by gratitude and respect, and a shared understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. 18 doctors could not save the Duke's baby, but one poor black boy did the unthinkable, and in doing so, he changed everything. The end.